Greetings, colleagues and students. Welcome to this video introducing another assignment on texts such as Thoreau's On the Duty of Civil Disobedience and other American literature titles, specifically higher-order thinking questions for On the Duty of Civil Disobedience and a literary analysis task based on that and other texts will be introduced and modeled. So, if you're interested in structuring assignments that promote higher-order thinking, stay tuned and like and comment and subscribe if you feel so inclined. So this first assignment for this unit is based on the essential questions for this unit, and it's entitled Poetry, Essays, and Nonfiction, Unit 2 Homework Essential Questions. As per the directions, we will be answering these questions multiple times, and we can base our responses off of different excerpts of the initial text we are reading, which is On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, or you can base one set of responses to these questions on this text and subsequent responses on one of the secondary texts, which will be used to respond to the literary analysis task of which I previously made mention. The questions are displayed, and I shall begin by modeling a response for the first item, which essentially asks us to provide an objective summary of whatever excerpt of the text you have read. When providing summaries, many students tend to draw too much from the verbiage used in the original work, and that can lead to unintentional plagiarism. So we can avoid that by defining any unfamiliar words and incorporating the definitions of those words into our summaries. This is also an excellent way to ensure that you understand what you are reading, especially when it comes to reading a text that uses a lot of complex vocabulary, like On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. These words may include heartily, motto, and we may have to define words that we are somewhat familiar with, but that don't make sense in the particular context of this particular sentence. This sometimes happens because many words have multiple meanings, and in order to determine what the author is saying, we must determine the best meaning of the word that is being used. As such, we may also have to define amounts. And we would likely have to define the words expedient and inexpedient, which are different forms of the same word that both have multiple meanings and are not used the same way each time in this text. Now let us see how I incorporated the definitions of some of these words in my summary. We first had heartily as a vocabulary word and motto, which mean vigorously or strongly, and a phrase that expresses a belief respectively. Since heartily essentially refers to the intensity to which the author accepts, we can say that the author fully agrees with, since accepting something can imply agreeing with something. And since mottos are phrases that are often used, we can say it's a saying that expresses a belief. And I end up with this first sentence. Notice how I did that with the definitions for the rest of the vocabulary words that we had identified. And pay special attention to the last sentence, in which I appropriately incorporate the two definitions of expedient and inexpedient. This word can refer to something being a way to accomplish a goal or the degree to which a thing is sufficient. And given Thoreau's original statement, it seems as though he is saying that governments are things that people have established to further certain goals and that they are often not sufficient. See how you can do this yourself, using your own understanding of the definitions of these words, and incorporate a summary of the next paragraph in your own response to this question as well. This second question here may require some research, as it is asking you how certain principles or policies of the United States may have been influenced by the ideas that are being presented in the text. So, in the first line of Thoreau's essay, he introduces this idea of the most efficient type of government being the one that manages its citizens the least, or that imposes the least number of rules on its citizens. In my response, I cited the First Amendment as an example of this, as it guarantees the right to free speech. You should also explain how whatever you cite is an example of U.S. policy or principles being influenced by whatever idea you are citing. For instance, I explain what it means to have the rights to free speech, and I explain how this is an example of governments governing less in comparison to other governments, which have things like blasphemy laws. If you don't know what those are, you can feel free to go ahead and look up blasphemy laws. And this last question is basically asking what the ideas presented in the essay mean for individuals living in society. For example, what should the individual do to make these ideas come to fruition or to make these ideas work? How can individuals living within a society ensure these ideas are being implemented or promote these ideas? These are all things to consider. My answer considers what an individual citizen can do to make the idea of having no government work. And in order to do that, they would have to assume more responsibility and learn to be self-sufficient without a governing body watching over them. Now on to the LAT. Take a moment to read over the prompt and determine in your own words what the prompt is asking of you. You may also want to consider how it requires us to use skills that we have previously practiced and how some new skills or concepts are being introduced. You may have responded that we are using skills that we have previously practiced because we are evaluating or determining the effectiveness of something, which is what we did with Miller's use of parallel plot structure in the LAT for the Crucible. You may also have guessed that we are determining what the author's point of view is that either of them are trying to convey. And we have done that before when we were trying to determine what the author's point of view is or would have been about McCarthyism for the Literature History Connection project. The new skill that we have yet to practice has to do with the author's purpose, and the new concept is rhetorical devices, which are things authors may use to attempt to fulfill their purpose. When it comes to purpose, there are several that an author may have, either informing, entertaining, or persuading. And sometimes it may be a combination of these, but for this assignment, we can say that the author's purpose is to persuade. And we want to determine how effective the author's use of rhetorical devices is in each text we are examining to persuade the reader of whatever point of view they have. Essentially, we shall assume that the author is trying to persuade the reader of his point of view, and we want to determine how effective the author's use of rhetorical devices is in achieving this end. In order to do that, we will have to familiarize ourselves with what rhetorical devices are, and these are examples and definitions of 3 of them. Take a moment to read these over, and define them in your own words, or provide examples of each. You may do this in the class comments, so that your peers can reference for their own understanding. For ethos, you may have responded that citing evidence from a doctor to convince somebody that a certain medical treatment is effective is an example of this, because a doctor would have authority to speak about medical subjects. For logos, you may have responded that engaging in a process of reasoning to prove a point would be a logical appeal. For instance, if I were trying to convince a child not to touch a hot kettle, I could start with the premise that the child does not want to experience pain. I can then introduce the notion that if the child touches the hot kettle, the child will experience pain. Therefore, the child should not touch the hot kettle. My claim is essentially justified through a logical process of reasoning. And for pathos, which essentially means an emotional appeal, you may have cited the infomercials that interview people with holes in their throats to convince one not to smoke. Such infomercials excite fear for the consequences, invoking one's emotions to convince the individual to take a particular course of action. In the case of those infomercials, the action would be to not smoke. Also note that for this particular prompt, since it is called Transcendentalism LAT, we may want to consider what the authors of the 2 texts' purposes may be with respect to the philosophy of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was a school of thought, and these are the fundamental principles of it. As for my sample response, it will be based on this fundamental principle of Transcendentalist thought that suggests that external institutions, like government, corrupt individuals. I am essentially going to say that both the works that I am analyzing are convincing the audience of the point that it is important to retain one's individual autonomy or independence and not to give that away to an outside governing force, because that will end up badly for the individual. I will be using the text on the duty of civil disobedience, and I have also opted to use a song by a band called Cradle of Filth to respond to this prompt. I have chosen this song because it relates to one of the optional texts, which you likewise are not limited to, as it is based on a European narrative that the American literary piece, The Devil and Tom Walker, draws from. It also contains verbiage that is at a developmentally appropriate level for the 11th grade. Since you know what I am arguing, let us go over how I constructed each paragraph of my response, not what I wrote. The skills associated with each paragraph have been explained in a previous video, so you may reference that if you need a refresher on the skills that are to be used for introductory, body, and concluding paragraphs. I will make mention of them briefly as I review how I constructed each paragraph. So in this first paragraph, take note of how I introduced all of the different topics in the prompt and organized those topics by making connections between them. You may want to determine how many topics are present in the prompt first, and you can respond to this question as a class comment. Moreover, you can add the following. How will you, similarly, introduce and connect all of the different topics? Let's focus on the first two sentences. You may have stated that in the first sentence I introduced the topics purpose or point of view and rhetorical devices. Those are indeed two things that we will be discussing in our response, and I make the relationship between those things clear because I state that rhetorical devices are the things that the author uses to advance his or her point of view or purpose. Then, in the second and third sentences, I go on to explain what rhetorical devices are by giving examples of different types of rhetorical devices and defining them, which is necessary because the reader might need some brief background information on these topics I am discussing. And in this last sentence here, I introduce the topics of On the Duty of Civil Disobedience and the Cradle of Filth song, Absent with Faust, as those are the texts that I will be discussing. I relate it to the previous topics by stating that there are examples of some of the rhetorical devices of which I had just made mention in both of these works, and that they both have a common purpose. In stating what that purpose is, I provide a partial answer to the question, and I could have made this thesis statement stronger by providing a more complete answer by stating whether or not the rhetorical devices were used effectively and what specific devices were used, but I address that in the body paragraphs. See how I do this in my first body paragraph. You may once again pause and read the first sentence of my first body paragraph and see how I provided a bit more of a specific response in my subclaim. You may have responded that I restated my original claim and then specified that the author of On the Duty of Civil Disobedience specifically used the rhetorical device of logical appeals. In the next sentence, I cite a quotation that justifies my claim about the author's point of view and purpose. This is the point of view of which Thoreau is trying to convince the reader. Then I provide an extended definition of sorts by explaining what the quote means. Then I state another relevant fact by describing how the author goes on to develop this claim, which also begins to address the type of rhetorical devices that Thoreau uses. I also provided an extended definition of sorts again, as I am interpreting the quotes that I am about to introduce. Then I provide the quote itself. And in the following sentence, which is the second to the last sentence of this paragraph, I explain how this quote is an example of logos. And in the last sentence, I addressed the part of the prompt that asks us to evaluate the author's use of the rhetorical device, stating that it was effective and how I thought it was effective. Then see how in the next paragraph I transition to my discussion of the Cradle of Filth song by saying that similar topics are explored, and I provide relevant facts about the story being told through the song because I need the reader to have some context. I continue to provide this background information in the next sentence, and then I move on to my subclaim, stating that the band uses a different rhetorical device to persuade the listener of their point of view, and that rhetorical device is an emotional appeal. Then I transition to the quote in which the emotional appeal is used by using a subordinate clause to provide context for the quote, and then providing the quote. There is an empty parenthetical there because I neglected to cite the line number, since this is a song and we would quote it like poetry. In any case, after this sentence, I provide my interpretation of the quote, and I explain how this quote was intended to elicit some type of emotion from the reader. Then I provide some additional interpretation, again provided an extended definition of sorts for my tech support, and in the last sentence, I explain how it is effective. Now let us take note of the concluding paragraph. Revisit the Crucible LAT video to determine what skills must be executed for the concluding paragraph if necessary, and then determine how my concluding paragraph fulfills those criteria. You may, once again, leave your response as a class comment. You may have responded that in these first few sentences here, I recapitulate my claim and how my claim was proven, and then I discuss the relevance or implications of the point of view that both works are expressing. You can certainly look up any words that I use here that are unfamiliar to you to make sense of how I relate this to individuals in contemporary times and what can be taken away from this point of view that both the author and the band are trying to convince us of. In any case, I'm essentially saying in my conclusion that people in general are typically inclined to believing that their prosperity is for others to make. There are many people that think governments should be responsible for keeping people happy. One example of this is the notion of universal basic income, UBI, and people essentially asserting that individuals in society should not have to work, and the government should provide them with money. People may think this to varying degrees, but an argument against that would be that people would have to give up their own personal liberties if an external force, such as government, were charged with making individuals happy, for they would be the ones determining what individuals' needs are and what constitutes happiness. The individuals themselves would have no say. They might get some immediate gratification, like free money, but in the long term, the individuals, in giving up their autonomy to decide for themselves what makes them happy, may have damned themselves, so to speak, like the two men in the Absinthe with Faust song. Concluding the essay as such is effective because I leave the reader with something to ponder with respect to the discussion about the points of view being expressed in both works. And the reader would ponder this because I related the points of view to things that apply to actual people, their behavior, and the fallout of their behavior. As always, reach out to me with any questions and focus on emulating how I constructed my response, not what I wrote in my response. And if you are a teacher looking for activities and lessons that require higher-order thinking skills of students, and you found this helpful, do leave a like, a comment, and if you feel so inclined, once more, I welcome you to subscribe.